There is much controversy around the old-growth logging in the Fairy Creek watershed on Vancouver Island, the impact of the Indigenous protesters' rights, the government's perspective, and the people's opinions need to be considered before a consensus can be made. My name is Rian.
And my name is Ara. Welcome to a podcast, Stumped, where we dive right into the root of the issue. On today's podcast, we will be discussing the protests at Fairy Creek Watershed and the Pacheedaht First Nations surrounding the old-growth logging.
You may ask, what is old-growth logging? Before we get into it, here's a list of terms to help you follow along.
Injunction, a judicial order that restrains a person from beginning or continuing an action threatening or invading the legal right of another, or that compels a person to carry out a certain act.
Ecocide. Ecocide is destruction of the natural environment that is widespread, long-term, and severe.
Grassroots, a process by which disadvantaged people organize themselves to improve social, cultural, and economic well-being of their families, communities, and societies.
Old growth, a generic term to describe forests with old trees. In British Columbia, for management purposes, this is usually described according to the age of the trees, usually 250 plus years on the coast and 140 plus years in the interior.
Performative activism. Activism done to increase one's social capital rather than because of one's devotion to a cause.
RFS, Rainforest Flying Squad, the name the Indigenous protesters called themselves at Fairy Creek.
Pacheedaht. Fairy Creek lies upon Pacheedaht traditional territory.
TFL, Tree Farming License.
OGMA, Old Growth Management Area. Defined areas that contain specific structural old growth attributes and that are mapped as fixed areas.
Forest Stewardship Plan, a plan which guides forest operations for a timber tenure required under the Forest Range and Practices Act.
Let's get into it.
So, as we were saying, the Fairy Creek area is home to one of the last remaining intact watersheds with ancient trees on Vancouver Island. The trees, some of which are over 1,000 years old, provide critical habitats for plant and animal species. They also play a crucial role in carbon removal. The removal of these trees would impact erosion and wildlife in the watershed, as well as create a disconnect in Indigenous spiritual practices. I'm going to start from the beginning of the story. Teal Jones Logging Company got a tree farm license, which pretty much means they could log the Fairy Creek old growth area. The Pacheedaht First Nations, hearing about this, decided to inquire with the local community and the government to see how they could stop this. They created a list of recommendations and sent that to the government, and they pretty much said an action plan of why they wanted old growth logging to stop and pretty much what would happen to their traditional territory if the biodiversity was lost. They highlighted the sixth recommendation, and it goes as follows. Until a new strategy is implemented, defer development in old forests where ecosystems are at a very high and near-term risk of irreversible biodiversity loss. This recommendation pretty much means that they wanted the government to halt Teal Jones from logging until they had a for sure action plan, making sure that the old growth logging would not harm the biodiversity and the traditional territory. In October 2022, BC Premier John Horgan called a snap election to secure an NDP majority, after 3 years of a minority government supported by the Greens. To appeal to the Green voters, one of Horgan's campaign promises was to honor the recommendations for protecting old-growth forests. This would also secure the votes of many First Nations. After the election, the NDP was granted the majority, but it was shown that this promise was performative action because they went nowhere. It was as if the recommendations were forgotten once he secured his majority. That's when protesters started to gather in response to the proposed logging operations after being told that there would be a change. These peaceful protesters were named Rainforest Flying Squad.
An injunction was issued to the protesters. Like a law or a bill, an injunction goes through the system and is issued to the public. From there, the police is tasked with enforcing the injunction. In this case, the injunction stated that the protesters could no longer block Teal Jones's private actions. Although this was issued, the protesters continued to blockade the logging, so the RCMP was called to enforce it.
From this, over 1,000 people were arrested. Then a lot of police injustices happened. For example, they covered their badges, they pepper sprayed civilians, and then when families were protesting, they selected minors to arrest, which is acting with a bias, knowing that this would impact families more. They covered their badges so the police weren't found guilty. So that begs the question, what was the protesters' rights versus the police rights?
Although the police were tasked with enforcing the law, that doesn't make them above the law, making these injustices illegal. On the other hand, the protesters were also breaking the law due to the injunction, despite their right to protest. The injunction was originally set as the government sided with Teal Jones. As a private company, their affairs shouldn't be interrupted, but it wasn't illegal per se to protest.
When it came time to renew the extension, BC Supreme Court Justice Douglas Thompson was opposed to the extension of the injunction.
He felt as though the police actions represented the court and therefore the injunction shouldn't have been extended. Justice Douglas Thompson released this statement along with his opinion on how he thought the protesters' actions were motivated through altruism and compassion.
In response to that, Pachidat elder Bill Jones released a statement saying, "It's a moral victory for us. Justice Thompson's words provide validation for the work we've taken on for the past 2 years."
Even though Thompson had these opinions, the court decided to extend the injunction anyways, saying that the police's actions were separate from the court and that the police's reputation doesn't correlate with the government's reputation.
In the end, the injunction was extended, but in June 2021, the government issued a statement deferring logging for 2 years. This followed the 6th recommendation I was talking about earlier. Now, we have an interview segment with MLA Finn Donnelly.
I'm Finn Donnelly. I'm the MLA for Coquitlam-Burke Mountain, and my parliamentary secretary role is watershed restoration. And I am on the traditional unceded territory of the Coquitlam First Nation.
Nice to meet you. We have a lot of questions, so we're going to get right into it.
All right, so so do you think the 2-year deferral of the old growth logging is enough?
Well, that's a great, so you're specifically meaning for Fairy Creek, not any other watershed? Okay, so
Yeah.
on the Fairy Creek on Vancouver Island, at the time, 2 years, I think is enough for the nations. So we're talking really the Pachidat, but also there are 2 other nations, neighboring nations, so the Dididat and Huayet. It's enough. It was enough, I think, to allow them and to work with the provincial government to determine what is needed to go forward. So, we know it's not enough time to figure out an entire land use planning process, because that's going to take many years. But it is enough to figure out where they want to go forward. So all nations in the province were given that time. We figured that was a good amount of time to discuss and decide the process, the go forward strategy.
Awesome. So, as a follow-up, we were just going to ask that if in that time the government has the resources to come up with an action plan. I know that's also hand in hand with the 3 nations as well, but do you think they have the resources to come up with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes and no. So yes, they have. Each nation has some resources to put towards land use planning, and but is it enough? Depends. Like the Pachidat have a 400-year vision. So that, it's a hard question to say, do they have the resources for that? I believe, with a vision that long, they feel like they will. The province doesn't operate in those terms. We don't have the foresight or the vision to go that long, unfortunately. Plus, we don't have the mandate. So we have a 4-year term. So that's, often you can look at, land use planning broader than that, but you can't commit resources beyond what you're mandated by the people of BC. But in this case, I think what British Columbia is doing, now that we have DRIPA in place, the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which came in 2019, which says all land use planning must be essentially co-governed with the local nation. The province has a duty to work with the Pachidat, Huayet, and Dididat to resource and give, and work with those nations on developing the capacity for, the planning process and for, whether it's logging plans, old growth plans, or watershed plans, and in my case, even wild salmon strategies. So we are figuring that out. It's very new. We also have to work with the federal government and local governments as well to try to engage them in the land use planning process. So it's complicated, but I think the answer is yes, that the province can provide the immediate resources needed, but not necessarily the long-term resources needed. And that will be a commitment that all governments, I think, have to commit to over the long term. I want to see that. I think our government needs to commit to a longer term planning process so that we have a vision like the nations of hundreds of years, because that's how forests work. They don't work on 4-year terms. They work on 400 or 500-year terms. So it's a much broader and better vision, in my opinion.
Awesome, thank you.
So we found that the province has jurisdiction under Canadian law to manage resource development, but the old growth is also home to several at-risk species, giving the federal government jurisdiction too. So is there a certain kind of way that the planning and communication works through that in moving forward, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. The planning process is tricky. So land use is generally provincial jurisdiction. It's definitely in the territory you're in. So the First Nation, territory you're in, they also have jurisdiction. The federal government, as you said, has specific elements. So species at risk, fish, wild salmon. There's certain elements that the federal government has jurisdiction over, and they can provide additional resources or prevent things from happening based on that legislation. But in general, the province has the most control over the land use in terms of the laws of the land. So that is, I'm going to say, changing. Nations are becoming, again, since 4 years ago, since 2019, with the province recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples, that there is a shift happening now with Indigenous law and Indigenous governance. And in my opinion, that's a healthy, good shift, and we need to encourage that. So we in government need to develop processes through what's called tables, where people come together. So that could be a watershed plan or an old growth protection plan in a particular area, and it will need a table. So it would need obviously the nation at the table, the province, possibly the local government, maybe the federal government, if there is a species at risk, maybe their particular government official sits at that table, and the community needs, so industry and labor and the community need input as well, because we're talking about livelihood. So for instance, if you were to stop any kind of land use activity based on this Species at Risk Act, that's a big deal, because you could put, if you shut down jobs or industry, you're going to put families at risk, right, in terms of the way they make money. So it's a balancing act to try to ensure that that families can continue to make money and have jobs, but not destroy the environment as they do that. And it's one of the reasons I got into politics, was exactly that issue, is how do we prevent the destruction of our environment, but still have jobs for communities and workers.
Right. And do you think, how long do you think it would take for that shift to happen, where the provincial and federal government both have the same view on working together with Indigenous communities?
Wow, that's a complicated question, because it depends who's in power.
Right.
So
okay.
It depends which party is in power and what their platform or their mandate is. I think right now you have willing provincial partner, you have a willing federal partner, and you have a number of nations that are also very interested, but at different levels of capacity. Some have a lot of capacity, which means they have resources and staff and sophistication. So an example of that is the Squamish Nation in North Vancouver. They have a lot of capacity. They're very sophisticated. They have a lot of money and they have resources, good staff.
Yeah.
But there's other nations that are much smaller. We just met this morning with the Quiquetla First Nation, and they're a very small band. They have 130 members. They're very small, and they're trying to develop their capacity. So it depends on the nation. It depends on the area of BC, and I think that's where you'll find who's advancing and where there's still a real need for support. On the coast, you have very sophisticated nations like the Haida doing some amazing work with coastal First Nations. So it really depends where you are in the province, and to determine the capacity of the nations, and then the processes, like for instance the watershed plan process, where we're really just getting started.
Right.
So we haven't really established tables, but just this morning, the provincial government signed a government-to-government agreement with the Cowichan tribes over their watershed. It's the first, water sustainability plan that's going to move towards a watershed plan in BC.
That's really great.
So exciting.
Yeah, that's such a big step forward. Yeah.
We need to do more of those, but
awesome.
It's going to take time.
For sure. All right. What do we have?
We have one more question.
This one? Oh, geez. Okay. So we're researching a lot about the protesters and the what's it called? Injunction.
That was placed over the logging and the forest, and also the kind of police RCMP involvement within enforcing the injunction.
Yeah, there was a lot of covering the badges and pepper spraying and a lot of stuff like that, and it's kind of concerning whenever obviously the government makes the laws, but then the police are there to enforce the laws. But if the police think of themselves as above the law, then what happens then, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead.
We were just wondering, what kind of control over the police does like the government have? And like we also read an article where I think it was Supreme Court Douglas Thompson. He was talking about I think he was leaning towards not extending the injunction due to the police's like behaviors and everything, but it was eventually extended because they said that the police's actions don't actually represent the government or like affect that the government's or court's reputation. So it would we were just wondering like something along those lines.
Yeah.
Well, I think you outlined it very well. So the government creates the laws, and then the workers, like police, have to work within those laws, and they have to enforce the laws. But there is also a line where they can't go outside the law, so overstep and overreach. That does happen because people are people, and sometimes people make mistakes. They, for whatever reason, police are no exception, but the police are put in a very difficult job. They have to defend, the rules, and sometimes on the other side, people are very passionate about things they believe in, even if it's not legal. So it's a really difficult position to be put in, but in the end, somebody has to do it. But you asked a question about oversight, and I think that's a really good question, is how do you ensure that if the police have gone too far, that there is a way for society to say, hey, we think that wasn't right. Well, there are oversight committees, and it's like a review panel. And if a complaint is made, and they're made often on particular issues, and the Fairy Creek protest was no exception. There were definite complaints made, and they go through the complaint review process, and then a decision is made based on that. And then based on that review, some kind of a penalty could happen. So for instance, the police officer could be found guilty of overreach and could be suspended or fined. If it was bad enough, could even go to jail. So they are not and cannot be above the law. They need to be held accountable just like everybody else, but they have a mandate, and they're protected under legislation to do their job, but they cannot go beyond their job.
Interesting. I'm glad you mentioned the oversight committees, because I don't think that's really covered by the media as much. So there wasn't as much to look at in terms of that. So we didn't know what happened to the police that did that, if they just went off scot-free, or if there was like a plan in place, because obviously you can't bring the police to arrest the police. So.
Right. Well, they actually do. They have internal investigations happening where they have specific type of police that will investigate other police.
Wow.
Yeah, that does happen. But you're right that unfortunately the media wants the controversy of the day, and that's usually the most of interest. That's what gets attention. Yeah. And that drives their readership or listenership. And so they tend to focus on what the latest controversy is. But as soon as it gets into, say, a trial or an oversight investigation, it takes weeks or sometimes months. And even in complicated cases, it can take years to get a result. And by then, the media has moved on to the next issue. So they don't have a big appetite for covering things that aren't as controversial. But you're right, they should. I think they should follow up, and they should, if they have covered the story, they should say, well, what happened to this? There was a
exactly, yeah.
What was the outcome? I get frustrated with that lack of coverage as well.
Because there wasn't much about what was the result of what happened to the police that were complained against, because I read that there were over like 150 complaints with the police during that protest, and
Right.
so I was just we couldn't really find much about like what happened, what was like the follow-up of that either.
Yeah, and each one of those complaints are taken seriously. Each one are going to be reviewed and looked into.
Right.
And you have to remember with anything, there are complaints that are, I'm going to say, legitimate, and some complaints that aren't.
For
So
sure.
there
Yeah.
needs to be a body that reviews that and needs to be fair and impartial, and they need to say whether the law was followed or whether the law was broken, and then
Right.
they need to render their judgment. And and it's not just happening on the blogging protests, it's happening on
Everywhere. Yeah.
everywhere and every day. And I mean, sometimes it's unfortunate that some police officers or people go too far.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
All right, take care, enjoy the rest of your day and weekend.
Yeah. You too.
All right, bye-bye.
And now we're going to share a little bit about our opinion on the issue. Our first question is a bit of an ethics question. If this had been a majority group and not a minority group like the Indigenous, would they have been listened to? For example, when Greta Thunberg was protesting, she had a platform and she had people behind her. She had a lot of school kids come and protest at their school, and it was all a peaceful protest as well. And they got listened to, and she had a spot at the UN. But I feel as if the Indigenous don't have that platform to share their perspective. From the interview, we heard that they're trying to integrate that more into like a table, and having the federal, provincial, and Indigenous groups all come together to discuss these big issues. But as Mr. Donnelly said, this could take a long time for us as a society to get there.
Although the government has been working with the Indigenous people, as we know, they still haven't really done anything, right? And although they are saying that they're working together, it feels as though the Indigenous peoples need to work a lot harder to just be heard. These protests are happening because they're not being listened to from the beginning, from the get-go.
Yeah, there's too much of a divide between the two.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And even though they also have the same kind of protest, they have a peaceful protest, they're against violence whatsoever, they are getting, I think, a much different treatment than others. And there was...
For sure, as every minority group is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was the Clayoquot Sound protest earlier as well, and that also had around the same numbers and the same kind of response, but this one just was like way bigger than that one, right?
Yeah. And I think now, like, after everything was discovered in 2019, it's getting better, and we're definitely on a road to get better, but it's taking too much time.
Yeah.
This should be almost instant after everything that society's gone through up until now.
Yeah.
This should be something that's like on the front line.
Yeah. And it feels as though, although Mr. Donnelly highlighted that they are working together and that it will take a long time, he didn't explicitly say anything that would be in the way of them, right? Because I get that it takes a while to come up with these plans and work together, and that they need to have the tables, but it really does feel as though there is something getting in the way of them.
No, for sure. And then he was also mentioning how they needed the resources to be able to put together the table, but he was saying with this issue, the provincial government had the means and the will to do it, like the NDPs were on board.
Willing, they were motivated. They had the motivation.
Federal government had the resources and motivation, and the Indigenous groups also had the resources and
they're putting in more than they should. They already have put in so much.
They have a 400-year plan.
Yeah.
Like they
they've done
put
their
in the work,
research.
yeah.
They've
Yeah.
already put in all this work.
For sure.
And so it feels as though the
What's
kind
stopping them?
of yeah,
Yeah.
it feels as though because the indigenous folks have put in so much work that the federal and the provincial governments kind of haven't been really pulling their own weight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our next kind of question was, what are our thoughts about the government deferral? So yes, they deferred it for 2 years. They deferred the logging for 2 years, but in those 2 years, do they actually have the motivation to put together an action plan within those 2 years?
Now, this is what I was trying to ask of Finn Donnelly, but it's like, what have they actually done within these 2 years? The deferral, it's 2 years, and he was stating that it would be enough time to find like a temporary like solution
Yeah.
to specifically Fairy Creek, but it feels as though they haven't really done much, right? And he was stating that it would take a really long time to kind of find that solution, and yet the deferral was 2 years, and so it kind of feels a little bit contradictory. I understand that this deferral is specifically towards Fairy Creek and that they're trying to find a temporary solution for Fairy Creek, but what have they actually kind of done?
Yeah, I think also the Pachidat nations were a little unsettled by it as well, because they felt as if this 2-year deferral was going to be up, and then it was just going to go right back to the logging again.
Yeah.
Right? And at the same time, the injunction was extended, but the tree permit was not taken down at
You're
all.
right.
Like,
Yeah.
that's still permitted. It's just at a halt for now. So after the 2 years, will they put a halt to the tree permit, or will it just be continued?
Yeah, and I feel as though during the interview, that was something that Mr. Donnelly was kind of hesitant
Skirting
on
around.
answering.
Yeah, he was using his president or his MLA talk to go around that.
Yeah.
So our third question here was, do you think extending the injunction was the right move to make? And my opinion was, I think that Justice Thompson put it great. He said that since there was all these police injustices, he doesn't think that it should be extended because, the police have no right to step on everyone, like think of them as above the law.
That's true.
Yeah.
But I also agree. It's good that they considered the people and where they were coming from and their kind of perspective from where they're coming from, because as we said before, they had no kind of hostile motives or anything. They were just kind of doing this from their beliefs and what they believed was right.
Yeah,
they were just trying to be heard by the government, right?
Yeah, and as we were saying, like, it was a peaceful protest. It's not like there's protests where there's violence, and then there's protests where they're chaining themselves to a tree so that logging trucks can't come through and take their trees. Like, there's a big difference, a big divide between the two.
Maybe the protest was a little bit extensive, and maybe it didn't have to be as kind of severe, but it's still
at the same time, it's how they got heard. Like, without that, I feel like they weren't seen, and this was their last resort to be seen.
You're right, especially since they were, again, like a minority group.
Yeah.
But going back to what Finn Donnelly was saying, we were talking to him about, you know, the reputation of the police and the court, and how we view kind of the reputation of the government, you know, because with, I think, us as like civilians that aren't very informed about what happens in the government, he was talking about how he believes that it's not really, you know, he kind of avoided the question and didn't really speak on it, and I think he was trying to say that it wasn't like he didn't he wasn't responsible for the police, right?
For sure, but also like as a civilian looking through, I know even when we were doing our research for this,
right.
It was really confusing as to what was happening to the police after the injustices.
Yeah.
When we look at the police, we look at the police enforcing the law, which is enforcing what the government is saying, right? But whenever the police messes up, and what Findonle was saying was like, oh, everyone makes mistakes, but I feel like this is not the place to make a mistake, you know?
I feel as though because they're the ones making the laws, if someone feels as though they're above the law, they have some responsibility.
Exactly. And from an outsider and a civilian's point of view, we don't know who's enforcing the police.
Right.
Because technically that would be the government, but you can't, what I was saying in the interviews, you can't send the police to arrest the police. But I think he really cleared up the whole part where they had I forget what they were called, but the like inside police that would enforce that to some degree.
But the thing is, as like people looking in from the outside, it feels as though they are connected, and that because we feel as though they should have some power or responsibility, that the police's kind of misbehaviors and like reputations would affect the reputation of the government. And,
for sure.
And I think the court that was saying kind of that were opposed to Douglas Thompson's opinions and were saying that they weren't correlated was kind of, it felt almost wrong, because we have such a different perspective. I understand that there's different, that there may be something that we're not aware of, but from an outside perspective, it feels as though this statement was kind of not from a good place. Yeah.
No, I agree. And press statements, like, you don't get the full lens. You only get one sentence of what someone's saying. And even at that, like, it's not enough to inform a whole population of what's going on, especially with the police.
It's hard to understand where they're coming from when they don't give us the follow-up.
Yeah, we don't have the full story. We don't have the follow-up. We don't know what's happening. So I think that was really difficult to grasp.
Yeah. Our next question is, do you consider Teal Jones's argument as a valid argument? Their argument was that Fairy Creek only makes up around 1,200 hectares, and that there are only 200 hectares available for them to log, and that was like an insignificant amount of the watershed that they were logging, and therefore it was justifiable.
Yeah, I disagree with that for sure, because I think that the whole land, like that, the land of a whole is traditional and spiritual territory, and I feel like even taking out 200 hectares or however much they wanted to, is it that much of an economical gain for as much as they're losing in spiritual land?
Right.
And I think that argument is very valid in saying like that land means more to a lot of people than the economic value.
That's true. And I know a lot of the counter arguments for this argument was that if you had a whole, this Fairy Creek forest as a whole, it's intact. There hasn't been any logging in it whatsoever earlier or prior to this. And their arguments were that if you were to take down even a small part of it, it's not intact anymore, and it feels as though it's more available for others, and that it's just not a whole thing anymore.
No, for sure. And they were also saying it being like an old growth forest, that means that everything relies on something else in order to thrive and survive, right?
There's like
and
the
so
circle
exactly, and especially the watershed too. So even cutting down 200 hectares of trees, that like those roots are what's preventing erosion from killing all the salmon in the watershed, and those trees are what houses a whole bunch of insects, a whole bunch of plants, a whole bunch of other animals, and all of that. It's just like the circle of biodiversity would be taken down just by those seemingly significant amount of trees.
And when they say that they're working towards it, they're still kind of permitting the loggings to happen, right? Like Teal Jones, even if they didn't come up with an argument, I think it was still kind of justifiable because they're a private company.
No, for sure.
Although it may be wrong, it's justifiable that they were going to go ahead with it.
Yeah.
Because they're a private company and
no,
they
I
need
was just
profit.
gonna say, Teal Jones wasn't in the wrong until they released this argument.
Right.
Because up until then, everything they were doing was right. They got their tree permit. They were logging, even though it was not something everyone wanted. It was
they
their
weren't
job.
in the wrong. It was justifiable. But when they came up with these kinds of arguments saying that these
like we're not taking all of it, we're only taking 20%.
Yeah, when they came up with these arguments that this small section was insignificant was just it. I think that was where they kind of crossed the line.
Yeah, for sure. The Fairy Creek old growth logging issue represents a pretty complex challenge that requires open dialogue and collaboration between the government, Indigenous leaders, and civilian perspective.
Balancing the preservation of irreplaceable ecosystems, respecting Indigenous rights, and addressing economic considerations is a complicated task.
It is essential for everyone to work towards finding mutually beneficial solutions that prioritize long-term sustainability and the well-being of both the environment and the affected communities.
That's it for today, everyone. Tune in next time on our podcast, Stumped, where we dive right into the root of the issue.